your place for all your AP, U.S. history, notes, and knowledge. Make sure that you mash that like button. I'm putting out a challenge. I'm not getting enough likes. If I don't get over 20 likes, I think I'm just going to have to call it a day and never make any more videos. So mash that like button. Tell your friends and your friends' friends if they like these notes that show how much they like them by hitting that like button. Let's go to the notes. Civil rights. When I say civil rights, you should be thinking Martin Luther King Jr. They go together like peanut butter and jelly. The civil rights movement starts, but not with Martin Luther King Jr. The modern civil rights movement starts with actually the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall and the amazing Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. It ends segregation in public schools, and the Supreme Court orders the desegregation of all schools with all possible deliberate speed. Right after 1954, Brown versus Board, then we got the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. It's when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. MLK shows up and they organize a bus boycott. A boycott means that they refuse to, they organize a boycott so nobody rides the buses anymore. It is a boycott is a type of peaceful protest, and it's very successful, and it ends segregations on the buses peacefully. Let's go. To test out the ending of segregation on buses, the Freedom Riders, this is organized by the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE. They take groups of white and African American activists on bus trips across the South to protest segregation. The protesters were attacked and one of the buses was burned, showing you that although segregation on buses is illegal, if you tried to desegregate the buses, you might run into some violence. James Meredith in 1962, federal troops are used by Kennedy to protect Meredith's right to attend the University of Mississippi. And then the March on Birmingham, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. is arrested for marching peacefully. He's put in solitary confinement where he writes his very influential and moving letter from the Birmingham jail. This results in a large protest in Birmingham where the cops attack the protesters with water hoses and dogs. It gets onto the national media. JFK sees it, and it brings the civil rights movement tons of attention. The leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Continued. He continues up this success, the March on the Clash at Birmingham success, with the March on Washington in 1963. It's one of the largest and most successful demonstrations in history. 200,000 blacks and whites from all over the country show up to spend all day protesting for freedom, jobs. Martin Luther King Jr. gives the amazing I Have a Dream speech. His dream was little black kids and little white kids holding hands together at the table of brotherhood. That is called integration. That was the dream. And then it ended with everyone singing We Shall Overcome, which was what we used as our intro music today. The result of the March on Washington is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation and discrimination in all public places. Let's go, Martin Luther King Jr. And he did all of that peacefully. He follows up this with the Selma March to Montgomery, Alabama. So it was a march, peaceful march to get voting rights for African Americans in 1965. It was met by the police with beatings and tear gas. They called it Bloody Sunday. Once again, the television was all over it, and it spread this across not only the country but across the entire world. It changed people's minds. It resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended literacy tests and grandfather clauses, making it feasible for more African Americans to vote and slowly change politics. Black Muslims and Malcolm X. A lot of African Americans were not happy with the slow pace of change, and they had a different approach to achieving equality. Some of these were the Black Muslims led by Elijah Muhammad. He created a group called the Nation of Islam, which preached black nationalism, or pride in being black separation, and self-improvement. This is reminiscent of Marcus Garvey way back in the 1920s, in case you wanted to know. Malcolm X Malcolm X was recruited into the Nation of Islam, where he became a leader in the Nation of Islam. He criticized Martin Luther King Jr. as an Uncle Tom, saying that he just didn't fight back at all. He advocated that you should fight back. So he famously said, "It's time to stop singing and start swinging." He was very good with words. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 by members of his own Nation of Islam after he left that organization to found his own organization. Malcolm X inspired others to reject nonviolence and achieve nonviolence as a method of achieving equality and to pursue a different dream. This dream was known as Black Power, riots, assassination, and more riots. So Stokely Carmichael takes over where Malcolm X left off. He was a former leader of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which, as you can see from the group, they organize sit-in movements and they use nonviolence. But then he became radicalized and embraced violence and created the Black Power movement. He wanted economic power and racial separatism. Related to, but not the same, is the Black Panther Party in 1966. This is Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, their revolutionary socialist movement advocating self-rule for African Americans, and had no problems with violence either. Speaking of violence, the Watts riots, LA in 1965, it was race riots, African Americans go on rampage, burning, overturning cars, looting, and after they did an investigation, they found that systematic racism and discrimination was why the riots started. And so what we start getting into is the difference between de facto segregation, which is segregation by fact, versus de jure segregation by law. The Civil Rights Act 1964 got rid of segregation by law, but as we can see from what happened after 1964, that places were still segregated and people were still discriminating even though there was laws against it. So they were just segregated by fact, not so much by the law anymore. Tragically, MLK is assassinated in 1968, and instead of peacefully mourning the loss, it results in massive riots in 168 cities and really marked the end of the peaceful civil rights movement that we think of when we think of the modern civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is not going to go away, and it will branch out into other things, but for this purpose, it is done. The Warren Court and individual rights. Earl Warren is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953 to 1969. He's the most influential Supreme Court justice since John Marshall, who did judicial federalism. If you guys remember, way back to the birth of the beginning of our nation, not colonial beginnings. A new nation, that's the unit that it was in. The court was focused on protecting individual rights. Here are some famous court cases by the Warren Court. This is by no means a complete list. There's way more, but I tried to put a lot of the really, really important ones. Brown versus the Board of Education is the one we already talked about, which ended segregation in public schools. And then he had the court had a whole bunch of cases on criminal justice, the rights of the accused, and freedom of expression and privacy. Mapp versus Ohio, the court concluded that any illegally seized evidence can't be used in court to prove someone guilty, even if they have the evidence. If they get it illegally, it has to be thrown out. In Miranda versus Arizona, the Miranda rights were instituted, which is the police, when they arrest you, have to inform you of your rights, saying that thing that they say on all the cop shows. Baker versus Carr is reapportionment, one man, one vote. It has to do with representation in Congress and reapportionment. Yates versus the United States. This is the court ruled that the First Amendment protected radical and revolutionary speech. Engel versus Vitale. School prayers and Bible classes violated separation of church and state, and you couldn't require students to have say school prayers. And then Griswold versus Connecticut, the right to privacy. A state cannot prohibit the use of contraceptives. Social revolutions and the cultural movements. Student movement and the New Left. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, 1962, was a radical student group. They had the Port Huron Statement, where they argued that students should get a vote in decisions affecting their lives. This continued on with the free speech movement in 1964 in Berkeley, California, where the students demanded an end to university restrictions on political activities. This also evolved into anti-war protests and a radical fringe group called the Weathermen, which used violence and vandalism to get their points across. The counterculture. During the 1960s, you had the counterculture. It was a rebellious style of dress, music, drug use, and hippie communes. They were called hippies and flower children. They had long hair, they wore beads, beards, jeans, and bare feet. They listened to people like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, who sang American folk music. And they also listened to rock music and psychedelic rock music at the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. I'm thinking of people like the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix, Jimi Hendrix was our thing off part 1. So if you want to hear some Jimi Hendrix, go back to Purple Haze from the intro of chapter 28, part 1. Counterculture of the 1960s faded as the baby boom generation grew into middle age, got jobs, and settled down. The women's movement causes increased education and employment of women, civil rights movement, sexual revolution, and Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, that was published in 1963. It encouraged women to pursue professional careers and contributed to a renewal of the women's movement in the 1960s. Betty Friedan went on to go ahead and found a feminist group called the National Organization for Women, or NOW. In 1966, they used activist tactics that they learned from the civil rights movement to get equal treatment for women. This culminated in the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. It was approved by Congress but failed to be ratified by the required 38 states. It was defeated by a growing reaction against feminism by people that feared that it threatened the traditional role of women. Achievements of the women's movement included fundamental changes in attitudes and hiring practices. Women started having careers in business, law, medicine, and politics, yet there was still a glass ceiling or an invisible barrier to the highest paid jobs in the corporate world. That, students, is the end of this episode. Our next episode, as you got a sneak preview right there, is going to be about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. All these things are happening mostly at the same time, so think of that. Make sure you like this video, comment, and keep on going, guys. We're almost there. We're only got a couple more chapters to go. I believe in every single one of you. Let's make it happen. Until next time, this is me, Mr. B History. See ya.